Welcome back, everybody. I'm Matt Williamson. You are watching Pop Goes the 60s, and Jude Kessler joins me again. Jude has been on here. I don't know, this must be your fourth time. Is that right, Jude?
That's right. That's right.
And
Good.
you,
Good.
yeah, and you've got another book out. We want to talk about your John Lennon series. You're on volume six. So let's give some of the viewers a little bit of a background on what you've done so far, and because it's been quite extensive work.
It has. This is year number 37, believe it or not. Isn't that crazy? It's really crazy. But thank you, Matt, so much for having me on. It is just so much fun to sit and talk with you. I wish I had a Matt Williamson hour every week and we just chat. You're such a great friend. And not only that, a very, very, very learned Beatles person. You know as much about this as I do, and I thank you for giving me a chance to share what I've learned over the last few years. But yeah, I started 37 years ago with the idea that this story, I was actually reading Michener's The Origin, The Life of Charles Darwin, which is an incredible story. But I thought, you know what? If I'll read 1,000 pages on collecting fossils and plants and rocks and writing the origin of species, which is great, but it's not as exciting as John Lennon. How much more would people love to hear John Lennon's story, which is full of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, not to mention the love of composition and art, and his in the later years his push for Irish independence and for freedom and for peace. And I mean, he touched people in every way that an artist can touch someone, visually, orally. He was an exciting person. And I think they'd like to hear that story. So I'm going to research it, really, really dig into the weeds, and then write it like a narrative so that people read it like they're reading a novel, but almost every sentence is documented and footnoted, and they're knowing that what the Beatles are wearing, they actually wore, what they're saying, they said, what they're doing, they did, that kind of thing. So I started with, of course, John's birth on the 9th of October, with the fallacy that Mimi ran in a bombing raid to get to him that night, because there was no bombing raid over Liverpool on the 9th of October. There was one Junkers 88 that was shot down over Aigburth, which is a suburb of Liverpool. And I'm sure that caused noise for, a few minutes, but that's it. That was all that night. There was no bombing raid. Number two, you would be arrested for going out of the house after sundown. Number three, Mimi was 32 years old. And at that time in history, 32-year-old women were middle aged. They were not in shape running. It was a different time. And it was 3.3 miles from 9 Newcastle Road to the Oxford Lying in Maternity Hospital. There is no way she's on the street running by herself. So we started with that, and we moved through all of John's very tragic childhood and even more tragic teen years to discover the little child inside the man. That book led to the follow on of 1961-63, when John has formed a band. He's pulling the people together, but he still doesn't have Ringo at that point. And they acquire a manager, Brian, and begin to move on to the world stage slowly. The next one is 63 through the early part of 64, when they make it huge all over the UK. But not until the end of that book do they come to America the first time and change history for well and for good. And then the next book is 64 and part of 65. We are well into 65 in the new book that's coming out. And it has been a wild ride. Matt, as well as I do, that as each year increased, they up the game. Oh, well, not only can you get up, if you'll be on movie set by 8 a.m., then you'll film until noon and then go sit in a car and do an interview during lunchtime, then come back and film. And then we're going to take you to the set of Ready, Steady, Go so you can film that. And then, John, you'll come home and you need to work on that book that you're publishing, and then gets up and does it all over again. Because when they're filming Helping Hard Day's Night, you have to be with makeup, hair on set by 8 o'clock. These were crazy times, and it has been a wonderful journey to be able to study it, meet all the people who were there, interview all the journalists who traveled with the Beatles and the DJs who introduced them, and John's early mates at Quarry Bank, like Dave Binion, who was the head boy, the headmaster, Patty Delaney, the doorman at the Cavern Club, Bob Wooler, Alan Williams. Well, I have to pinch myself. What kind of life am I living?
Well, you have spoken to all these people and talk about getting a good feel for what was going on, and to compile all that information into a cohesive book is not easy to do. So I understand why it's taken you so long. And your volume 6, which is due out early 2025, is going to cover roughly August 65 to from about March 66. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I had intended to go to Candlestick Park. It was my wish that I would end that book with George saying, I'm not a Beatle anymore. And that would have been a perfect ending point. But yesterday I had a real come to Jesus meeting with my editor, and she said, listen, you're not going to make it. So we've toned it back a little bit.
Well, one of the things that I think is very interesting about your research, and when people research as much as you, there's always new stuff coming out. And when you start adding up a lot of the research, it tells a much fuller story. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was this American tour in 65, which was very much a repeat of 64, but they're doing much bigger venues and stadiums and things. But things are getting really crazy. And a lot of the things that went on was quite violent. And we don't really hear much about that, but your book will go into that.
Shades of Light Part 1 ended as they were getting on the plane to come to America. It was early on Friday the 13th, and they were headed to America for the second North American tour. They had come in February of 64, so it's their third trip, but it's their second North American tour. And the book begins with the sentence, "It all depended on the press." Because here's the deal. We all say we love a winner. Everybody loves a winner. But the truth is, people really don't like a winner. And the Beatles have been on top now for a long time. And the press is starting to turn. They really turned on them in 1964, the very first time that, and it wasn't the Beatles' decision, that the police said, you cannot land at the airport. It's too dangerous. People are getting hurt. Girls are going through plate glass windows. There are people who are getting trampled. It's too dangerous. And they made them land at a military airport about 4 or 5 miles away. And that is when the press started to turn on them, because they were like, you should have made this happen for the fans. And the Beatles like, we wanted to make it happen. We had no control over this. This was the police. Well, at one point in Minneapolis, a reporter says, you should have to pay for the police who are there making sure that you're okay. And to be honest, you don't even need the police. You're 4 young men. You should be able to handle this. And Paul says, well, we can't do that. There's only 4 of us. And they said, well, you're strong young man. You should be able to do it. George says, well, maybe you could because you're fatter than us. He's not happy. But you can see it start to get edgy. Well, in 65, they walk into the press conference in New York, and the atmosphere is completely different. There are all kinds of questions about, aren't the Rolling Stones bigger than you are now? What about the Kinks? What about all these bands that are starting to surpass you, which they weren't? I mean, Beatlemania, the crowd that said goodbye to the Beatles in London airport when they left on the 13th of August was the biggest they'd ever had. So it wasn't. But you see, that's the first thing, is that you see the press beginning to turn against them. So I jotted down a few of the things that happened. You're talking about the violence of that tour. They get to Toronto. Toronto was pretty violent the year before because for some unknown reason, as you know, they decided that Ringo was an English Jew. And there was a lot of anti Semitic feelings in Toronto at that time. And he got death threats. I mean, they actually received, the police received threats saying he was going to be killed. So they don't let them go in the limo to the concert. They take them in an armored police van, and they're surrounded by armed guards because they're still afraid that someone's going to kill Ringo. And when they get to the press conference, the press is mad about it. They are asking them, why do you deserve this kind of protection? And who do you think you are? And that kind of thing. And this is one female reporter whose microphone won't work, gets mad and says, you need to give me a private interview because I traveled 30 miles to get here. And Paul says, quote unquote, 30 miles. The lady drove 30 miles. Everybody give her a big hand. I mean, you can see things are starting to get a little dicey.
Mhm.
So they go on to Houston. And in Houston, and this is what Alf Bicknell, John's driver, who he's invited to come along with them, writes, a terrible start to the day. We almost got killed. Yeah, that'll put a damper on your day. Landing in Houston at about 2 a.m, and they did that intentionally because the crowds were so big and so dangerous. The fans were waiting for us. They swarmed all over the plane, the wings everywhere. We were shouting at them to get off. Some of them were smoking, and the stewardesses were screaming that we were going to blow up. The boys took it very well, but I think they were as scared as we were. At one point, when they land in Houston, and this is what we hear, is thousands, not hundreds, thousands of fans broke the police cordon and they ran toward this Electra 2, a propeller plane. And these propellers are whirring. And fortunately, the pilot was smart enough to turn the plane slightly and shut the engines off. And he stops it before they get there. But they climb all over the plane. They bang on the fuselage. They're pressing their faces up against the windows. They're smoking. They're covering the plane. And Brian says, can't we just take off and go to a different airport? Paul says, we can't take off. What about these people on the plane? They're not going to get off. And John says, hey, let's have a contest. And the fan that hangs on the longest gets free tickets to the next concert. Well, after about 45 minutes, they bring out a high catering cart that has expandable legs that can come up to the emergency door. And they all get out. And as they get out, and they all have to, there's a big gap where they could fall, but they help each other and they get onto this cart. Alf Bicknell loses his balance and he starts to fall, and they all catch him. But just as this happens, the fans start throwing purses and shoes and lipstick cases and hitting them. And Brian gets hit just below his eye with a lipstick case. And this is dangerous stuff that's going on here. So that's Houston. San Diego, they're staying in Los Angeles. That's during the time that they go to see Elvis. And so they're still at the Los Angeles house. So they rent a bus, a tour bus, to go down to San Diego. And the bus is horrible. It's ratty. It's old. It's who knows why they chose this bus. But it breaks down. It won't start to go down there. And when they get in the bus to leave the concert, it will not start. And the fans are running onto the field and they're like, make it start, make it start. And they're trying, everything they can do to get it going. Finally, just as the fans are almost there, they get it going and they leave. But about 2 or 3 miles away, at a mortuary of all places, the bus breaks down and they have to coast into the drive of the mortuary. And the fans who are following them in their cars surround the bus. And Ivor Davis says, I thought we were goners. I mean, they were rocking the bus. We're thinking we're dead. We're totally dead. And the police show up. They're able to get the fans away and they get the bus fixed and they get out of there, but it's a close call. Hollywood Bowl, they're jumping in the reflecting pool and clawing their way up onto the stage, but nothing, and I mean nothing, is like San Francisco. The afternoon concert, there were so many people injured. They're crushing each other, they're crawling over each other. It's just a melee. And they stopped the afternoon concert. Paul stopped it and said, calm down, we're going to have to stop the concert if you don't do this. Well, that was just a warm-up for the evening concert. There is a 10-foot high mesh fence that's built behind the Beatles. And in the afternoon concert, they don't think about climbing it. But that night, it's just covered with fans, the way you would take ivy and put in a mesh fence to make it look good. There are fans everywhere. And as they begin to climb it, it's just a wooden structure with mesh. It starts to collapse. Ringo, you can see him. He keeps looking back because it's right behind him. And I don't know whether a young man dropped from that mesh or if he made his way up the stage, but suddenly, right by Ringo, there's a guy standing there patting him on the shoulder. And, that's a little bit disconcerting. He doesn't do anything, but he's there. And then the fans start, that kind of gives them the impetus, and they start rushing the stage, and they are climbing over each other. They're stepping on people. You can see them littered, passed out all over the stage. The photos are just unbelievable. One girl collapsed halfway on the stage, halfway off. And the ones that can't get there start throwing their folding chairs, their metal folding chairs. So, they say, what do you want to do? And Paul says, well, I'll talk to him like I did this afternoon. And let's see, I have his exact quote for you. He says to them, calm down. Really, things are starting to get dangerous. Calm down. And then they have a head-to-head meeting. It's John and Paul and the guy that's running the whole show for San Francisco and Brian. And they say, John, because it's still John's show at this point. I mean, it's still John's show in 64 when Charlie O'Finley wants them to come to Kansas City. They don't ask the other Beatles. They ask John, what do you want to do? He's making the decision. And they say to him, what do you want to do about this? And he says, we're going to finish the show because none of us are hurt yet. And these kids waited all summer to come to this, and they paid to be here. And if they want to throw chairs, they paid to throw chairs, and we're going to finish their show.
How far into the show were they when they had the meeting?
They only had 2 more songs to do.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, it's at the end.
30-minute sets. Yeah. If they're lucky, they probably played those 2 songs awfully fast.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. But I mean, this is, you got to think we're headed towards the summer of 67. We're only 2 years away, not quite 2 years away from the empowerment of youth who realize that they're not to be, as my parents always told me, children are to be seen and not heard, but not anymore. They're realizing, and the Beatles have done this, they have made teenagers realize that they have a voice, they can express themselves, that they're allowed to speak up and speak out, and these teenagers are not going to sit in their seats and behave.
And were the people that much older in 65? Because I mean, a lot of the shows I've seen and all the footage, it's more younger girls between the ages of like 9 and 13.
Yeah.
So you said there was a guy, was it a boy that got over the fence and put his hand on Ringo's shoulder? What can you describe who that was?
He's an older teenager. I'm guessing he's like 18, 19. And a lot of the ones who are collapsed on the stage are not little girls. They're teenagers. I'm sure there are tons of young little girls, little teeny boppers out there screaming, but the ones that felt empowered to come on that stage were teenagers.
Wow. Yeah. Why is it that we don't hear those stories at all? I mean, the stuff that you've told me, this is stuff that you don't hear about, and I don't quite know why. I mean, it's terrible, I suppose, but especially the ones who get hurt. But why is that something that gets passed by? It sounds pretty sexy to me. Why wouldn't that get talked about?
I don't know. I really don't know. And there's so many. I mean, to me, the San Francisco story, although it's horrific, is an important story because it reveals something about John Lennon's personality that, Mimi has raised him to believe that a job worth doing is worth doing well. And all of the years that he mows half the yard and comes in and says, "Is that good enough?" Because he wants money. And she says, "No, you're getting nothing until the job is finished." Has become ingrained in him so much that, and in all of the Beatles, their work ethic is so strong. Nobody worked as hard as they did. And most people would have walked off that stage and would have said, "Enough of this." But the
Well,
Beatles,
where was Brian in all this? I mean,
oh, he
he's the
was there.
manager, but why is he not making the decisions? Well, what he seems to be kind of absent. I mean, he's the guy that is pushing them in these, obviously the 66 tours, very much he's pushing because that's where how he makes a lot of money.
Yes.
And it probably is a good moneymaker for George and Ringo too, are not in on much publishing. But what is Brian saying through all this? I mean, all this danger, all this mayhem. Why is he not getting asked by the press?
Oh, I'm sure. And he was one of the people in that meeting, but he routinely deferred to John to make the decision. And I know they all talked about it. They were all there. I'm sure Paul made his feelings known about what he wanted to do as well. But that was the way that it went. John had the last decision, and he's like, "Nobody's been hurt yet," or didn't say yet. He said, "Nobody's been hurt." And they paid their money and they deserve to get a show, and we're going to finish the show.
Now, is it safe to say, because we always hear how about the Beatles were getting tired of touring. So this is all going on in 65.
Yeah.
So they sign up for a huge world tour in 66. I mean, is it just safe to say they did it for the money?
No, they don't want to go. I mean, which is exactly why John writes "And Your Bird Can Sing," because George and John have said Ringo liked touring. Ringo enjoyed it. He didn't like being separated from Maureen, but he enjoyed the tours. And I think Paul, to a certain extent, enjoyed the tours. I mean, he's still touring. He liked people and he liked performing and all that. But John and George were like, "We are done. No, 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 no." And Brian keeps saying, "You can't do this. I know you don't want to do it, but your whole career depends on being in the public eye. You've got to do it." And uh, yeah, they're really frustrated. And then when things in the summer of 66 turn out as terribly as they do because of the Budokan, what happens in Manila, then they go to India and it's horrible. And then of course the
Mhm.
Maureen Cleave article breaks. And
Mhm.
in Date Book, the one couple of lines lifted out of context, and then the 1966 North American tour is a disaster as well. So
Yeah, it doesn't seem like John was calling the shots for that. It sounds like he wanted to not tour at all, but
right,
it sounds like he either agreed or was,
right,
convinced by Brian or the money. It's the money. I mean, you always got to follow the money. I
yeah,
mean, these guys were living lifestyles and you want to keep up that money. And obviously George and Ringo were making money from that. I think that's probably
yeah,
an important thing, but I can't believe that. Why would they do such a elaborate tour in 66? I
yeah,
mean, they could have, if it was such a pain in the ass, if it was getting so violent, why didn't they do something more scaled back in 66? They'd still be in the public eye. You could still
yeah,
do some big markets. I
yeah,
mean, maybe the press would have maybe been on their ass for that, but that's to be expected. So I'm surprised that after this tumultuous 1965, that Brian scheduled them so aggressively in 66. Was he trying to do? Kill him?
he thinks I honestly think that Brian really believed that that was the way to be successful. That the Beatles believed the way to be successful was to put out wonderful, unique, artistic, creative records. As they watched the teenagers of the 60s change from teeny boppers into adults, they were changing with them. And Rubber Soul is so different. It's that transitional album where they start to tell stories, use instruments from all over the world, write things that are really creative. They're changing. And they believe that they can have a career in the studio. putting out great LPs. Brian does not agree with that. He thinks that you have to be on TV. Now he's going to take a different tack in late November or early December of 65. He lets them go into the studio in Twickenham and record promotional videos that they can put on TV shows rather than
Hmm.
having to go and be there in
Hmm.
person. So he's beginning to see some of that. This is how I can hedge my bets and get around them a little bit. And he's beginning to cut back on what they do. For example, they don't do anything in the public until they do New Musical Express in 1966. January, February, March, they're not going in front of the public. And he's sick about it because he thinks it's wrong. He sincerely believes that's a way to be popular. Me
Hmm.
wanted to do A Talent for Loving, do another film in 66, which they refused to do. I think it was a battle between, I think we can make records. I think you have to go into the public.
Yeah, Brian clearly had a lot of say, and he was the manager. And
Yeah,
I mean, the whole Hollywood way of doing things, I can understand that and why they were doing what they were doing and
right.
trying to do films and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
actually, 1965, when did Help get released? Was that summer of 65?
Yes.
So, that film is not a step forward at all, film wise, cinema wise. It's a step sideways at best. So I think, and then obviously there was the lure of the stadium shows, which
Right.
were much bigger revenue generators. So yeah, I think that there was all kinds of that Hollywood thing that was eating at him. And Brian he was very much in tune with the stage.
Yeah.
So I
But
think, mhm.
the 64 doesn't really make money for them though, Matt. They learned their lesson. Because the 1964 North American tour, by the time that they paid their taxes, which they were insisting that they pay, and they gave lavish parties every night for the
Mhm.
press with drink and food and all this. They ended up not making very, very much money off of that 1964 tour. So when they go on the 64 homeland tour and they go all over Scotland and Wales and England, Brian puts them at the shabbiest places you have ever seen. They are
Mhm.
eating in the dressing room on these little tables that are in front of the mirrors. They get their food there and they're eating there. And then they go to these shabby hotels because he spent a little bit too much money on the 64 North American tour. So I don't know. For Brian, everything was about the dream, was about uh a dream of theatrical greatness.
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that the 64 tour, I mean, the Beatles had to be put over
Yeah,
in America.
I
So I
did.
can see the lavish treatment of the press. No
Yeah,
wonder everybody was so fat and happy. They're all, well, we know what was going on,
yeah,
and it was a lot of fun. So that's
yeah,
how you keep them quiet and keep them, from giving you any bad press, I guess.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, it was costly. It was very, very costly. And 65 was pared down. I mean, they had far fewer venues, and you didn't crisscross the United States. It was planned, it was logical, but by 65 the crowds are vehement. And it's not just that Beatlemania has grown. It has grown, there's no doubt about it. Beatlemania, everyone that wants to say that by 65 it was petering out, that's not true. It was rampant in 65.
Hmm.
But the other problem is that you're beginning to get youth that are not going to sit in their seats. When the Beatles played Indianapolis in 1964, those Midwestern teenagers, and you still go to Indiana today, and it's a different world. They sat in their seats and they screamed, but they didn't rush the stage. They didn't throw things. They sat in their seats and they sang along with the songs. And at one point, John is like, they're not screaming, they're singing. It was a different era. By 65, everybody's empowered. And by 66, I mean, 66, they're really empowered. So, you're watching the 60s unfold.
Hmm. For sure. And so you're going to end the volume six in March of 66 with the Maureen Cleave publication. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, because
Interesting.
the feeling that John had when that came out in the London Evening Standard was most of the time in John's life, he's not happy with himself because there's some reason that his mother didn't want him. She wanted the two girls, she wanted Jackie and Julia, but she didn't want him. And he doesn't know why. And he figures it's something that he did wrong because in so many songs he says, "I'm sorry, I'll be a good boy. I won't let you down." He apologizes. He's constantly thinking he's done something wrong. But when that article comes out, he thinks he's done everything right. He has been honest. He's been vulnerable. He's opened up his heart. He's talked to this lady about how he feels and his doubts, his frustrations, his search for faith that he's having a very difficult time with. And he thinks he's done a good job with it. And that's where it ends, with him being very happy with this article that's come out and feeling like he's been what he's complaining about. And Andrew Bird can sing is, "You don't hear me. You don't see me. You don't get me." But it seems like Maureen Cleave has heard him and she's seen him and she gets him and he's happy. And then when the next book begins, we find out that Date Book lifts that one little snippet and publishes it, and literally all hell breaks loose. But have we talked before? I'm looking for the book, about the book that John was reading that got him to say that quote.
Yes, we have.
Yeah,
And I don't have the title handy. That's a book
I've
I've been
got it
reading
right
about.
here. Let me
Yeah,
grab
grab it if you would.
it. I
Yeah,
know
that's
it.
a book I've talked about on this program a couple of times because Lennon was a voracious reader and he was reading book after book after book, probably a book every week. And the quote with the Jesus Christ quote really comes right out of this book. Why don't you tell us the title there? I can't quite
Yeah,
remember.
it's the Passover plot, and it's by Hugh Schonfeld, Schonfield, eminent translator of the New Testament and author of Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also author of Jesus, a Biography. And it was a number one bestseller. And John, who reads about 3 books a week, is reading it. And he's really impressed with this guy. And I mean, I read the whole thing because I wanted to, see what it was that he was reading. And basically, it says that, Jesus was right on target. It never really comes out and says he is either the Messiah or the Son of God, but it says he was a great prophet, but his disciples were thick and ordinary, which is what John quotes, and
Hmm.
that they didn't ever get what Jesus was trying to do. And John says they're the ones that ruin it for me because they don't get it. And he is quoting this book. He thinks he's being real artsy and he's being current and he's showing how intellectual he is, that he's read Schonfeld's book. And he's not really trying to be anti-religion, or as he says, or anti-God, or he is trying to show that he's a smart guy who's up with the latest books and that he is thinking about things like faith and belief, and that he's not just thinking about them, he's reading about them and he's staying on top of things. Oh man, does that blow up in his face.
Yeah, I guess I wonder if he learned his lesson from that. But he tried to sound intellectual throughout a lot of his life, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
Yeah, I don't think he learned this lesson. No.
Well, one of the things that the Maureen Cleave interviews, because she interviewed each member of the band, and
Yeah.
every member of the band actually had some very more controversial things to say. I mean, they were totally coming out of that mop head image, and they wanted very much to be away from that.
Yeah.
So I think this interview, going into this interview, all of them knew they were going to let loose a little bit,
Yeah.
and they do. So, and it was just this one Lennon quote that gets
Yeah.
blown out, that blows up. Meanwhile, the other stuff is pretty much ignored.
I know. And it's good stuff.
It is very good stuff.
And of course, I think I was probably in the 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade. Can't remember when the whole controversy started. And my first reaction was, okay, that's it. I'm taking all my stuff down. And I took it all down. And I have a picture of me in front of my bulletin board with Herman's Hermits on it because who were you going to put, And then I started thinking about it. And a couple of days later, I sat down and wrote an editorial for our local newspaper that said, John Lennon is right. How many of us who are teenagers are going to youth group every week, are really excited about going to church, or like, I can't wait for Sunday. Yeah, 4 more days till Sunday. But if the Beatles are coming to town, it's a different thing. They are more popular. That's all he was saying. Not better, not holier, not anything, more popular. And he's not wrong. And, of course, I got into trouble too, but it some of what John said and the anger that it still foments. I just spoke to it wasn't a Kiwanis club, it was a Rotary Club in Bossier City, Louisiana. And when they introduced me and said that I was going to talk about John Lennon, about 6 to 8 people got up and left
Mm,
before they even heard what I had to say.
mm.
So, that anger that was fomented by that snippet that Date Book removed is still very much alive today. It may have been an impetus for what we see with the jumbotrons in a lot of churches and the teen services that appeal just to teens. You have to sit down, you stand up, you dance, you're part of the service. He was saying, look, either wake up or die. You're not that popular anymore. It may have had a big impact. Who knows?
Well, I think it did. And, everything was changing in the 60s and all these things were being challenged. So that, of course, the Beatles were at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
So it stands to reason that they would be the ones to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, but I think it's such a poignant way to end the book with him finally thinking, okay, someone at last has heard what I have to say.
Meaning Maureen Cleave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
they
get,
love
mhm.
it. She goes with them on the 1964 visit in February. She's on the plane. She's in Buckingham Palace when they get the MBE, and she's covering it for the London Evening Standard, but that's their friend who's with them, and they trust her. And, he just thinks it's okay to say what he wants to say. It's never okay to exactly say what you want to say. We all know that. You know it, Matt.
Well, John Lennon pretty much always has gone by that rule, saying what he feels like saying. And, I mean, and that's why a lot of people love him for it.
Yeah,
And even when he puts his foot in his mouth, oh, yeah, that's old John. He's just being honest. How wonderful is that?
I know.
Not always.
Yeah, and you can trust that person. My favorite story, and Paul would verify this. He's the one that told the story. Is when he was a little boy, his mom would get on him about something, and he would say, you're right. I deserve it. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. And then he would go into her bedroom and take scissors and cut a little snippet off of her Irish lace curtains because really he was mad about it and didn't
Mm.
think he deserved it. But Paul was the PR guy that always could say the right thing when they hit those two ladies at a stop sign on the Scottish tour. They run into those two old ladies who are stopped at a stop sign. Get Paul out there, he'll make it right. He always knows the right thing to say. He's the one that get to quiet the crowd down, not John. He can put his best foot forward, but John is just going to tell you like it is, and he's just sometimes he doesn't mean it. When Charlie O'Finley begs and begs him, John, please play another 2 songs. I paid so much money for you. Would you play another 2 songs? And he says, you shouldn't have paid so much money for us, Chuck. But what does he do? Plays 2 extra songs because he does
Mhm.
the hey, 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 Kansas City medley. So that's 2 songs.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Well, let's change gears here a little bit because I know that you've been busy all these years writing the books and you've started to add audio and you have a very great voice talent that helps you with that. Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
I just don't have the right words. And as a writer, that's really sad, but I don't have the right words to praise the work of Scott R. McKinley enough. I found Scott because he did the audiobook for Jay Bergen's award-winning Lennon the Mobster and the Lawyer. And he sent me a link, and I thought he wanted me to listen to the audiobook and just said, give me your thoughts. Am I doing John well enough? What could I do better? And I thought, oh man, I don't want to hear this. I can't stand John Lennon impersonators. They always play to the silly, and they never get John's voice right. And I'm gonna not like this, but he seems like a nice guy. I'll do it. So I downloaded it. I started listening and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is John Lennon. He was so good. And I've talked to you about this. John had a habit, if he was going to say no, he would almost never just go no. He would go, nah, no. I didn't have that in the book. Scott put it in the book because he studied John. He studied him so much, he knew that's what he did. He was so good. So I called him and said, look, can you do Paul as well as you do John? And he's like, yeah, I think so. And I said, what about George? And he goes, George is my best. He's my best. I'm like, what? And I said, Ringo. And he goes, yeah, I can do Ringo. I can work on it. Well, I said, would you be interested in doing the third book in the John Lennon series, which is the height of Beatlemania? It is where Beatlemania breaks out, and they play Sunday night at the London Palladium, and they play the Royal Command performance, and they go to #1 in America with I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then they come to America, do Ed Sullivan, and yada, yada, yada. He said, well, let me look at it. And he called me a couple of days later and he said, do you know there are 183 voices in that book? I said, well, no.
Hmm.
He goes, there's Trini Lopez, and there's Bobby Goldsboro, and there's Cousin Brucey, and there's Ed Sullivan, and there's Neil, and there's Mal, and there's Tony Barrow, and there's Brian, and there's Cynthia, and there's Mimi. And he starts listing them all. And I'm like, can you do that? He goes, well, I'm going to have to take a few months and learn these voices. I have to study them. I have to listen to them. I have to get them in my head. I have to make notes on what they do. And I'll attempt it. It took him a full year to do the audiobook of She Loves You. And I am, you know me well enough to know, like, I am not a optimistic person. I always think everything is going to go wrong. And I think it's the best thing I've ever heard. I would give people, if I thought people were, everybody was above board, I would say money back guarantee. That's how good it is. It is a 33-hour trek through 63 and the first 2 months of 64.
Wow.
And 183 authentic voices. You're there with the Beatles. You have time traveled. I sent one, I told you yesterday, I sent one to a good friend of mine who's really dealing with back pain. And he is such a sweet person and a historian, really great Civil War historian. And I sent one to him in hopes that it would take him away from the pain. And he wrote me an email and said, I really kind of opened this just, to make you happy. And oh my gosh, I can't get enough of it. You're there. You're so there. It's amazing.
Wow. So, one of the things I want to bring up about your work and just your writing style is what you put into the story. It makes it so much more, you can feel it more. And I would think that with the audio version now, it even feels more real.
Yeah, you're there. My husband wrote some music that begins the book, which kind of takes you back in time. And then the Black Ties, a great band, they're at the Fest for Beatles fans. Amazing. They're so Beatlesque that I went to them and said, would you let me have two of your songs to use in the Cavern Club? Because She Loves You, Volume 3, encompasses the last night in the Cavern Club. And you see what the Beatles feel as they each come in. Ringo comes in first, and then George, and then Paul, and then Brian, and then finally John will come in, and you in between each segment, a bit of the Black Ties is playing, and you can really get the feeling of the Cavern Club, that grit and dirt and the subterranean smell. And it really is a magical experience.
Well, very good. Yeah, I've heard parts of it. So I was very impressed as well. So that, I think some people are just cut out to listen to that kind of stuff. Some people prefer the written word, so it's great to have these options.
Yeah, and I love to read too. I mean, obviously, I am a bookaholic. A guy came to paint our house a couple of years ago, and he said, I can't paint all their books everywhere. I love books, but this was I know all of the dialogue since I wrote it, but the way he delivered it, he made me cry. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to it, just boohooing. He made me fall off this chair laughing. It's a lot to be said. That's why we go
Mhm.
see movies. That's
Sure.
why, because it's actually happening in front of you. You're there, and it's really one of the best things. If I was gone tomorrow, I would say, well, we've got that audio book. It's really magical.
Well, let me change gears again here. You and I talked in planning for this discussion, and we got onto AI.
Oh yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting thing because we hadn't planned to talk about that initially, but the idea that AI can write history. And I'm really very skeptical about anything, any kind of software algorithm that can put any kind of soul into anything. So you had an example for us, don't you?
Yeah, and I am not anti AI at all because I was telling you the other night when I was working on the chapter about the Beatles at Buckingham Palace, Bill Harry in the Ultimate Beatles Encyclopedia said that one of the headlines the day that they went for the investiture was Beatlemania at Buckhouse. And I thought, oh, I want to start the chapter with that. But which newspaper had it? So I went through my tons of books, and I have done, here are the notes. I mean, I have pages and pages and pages of typed notes about the investiture. No one knew. No one knew which paper it was in. And so then I started going onto the internet, and which newspaper said Beatlemania at Buckhouse. No one knew. No one knew. And I thought, I am wasting so much time. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to type it into Copilot, which is my AI from my computer. And I typed it in, and it came up and said, scanning all London newspapers for the day of 26 October 1965. And then it said the Daily Mail. I wasted 40 minutes on doing that.
Well, I
You
can
know,
see where it's helpful that way, where it
yes,
helps you maybe locate
yes,
something.
yes,
But
that's
when it starts writing the history for you, that's where I draw the line. I mean,
right.
if you
Right.
held a gun to my head and said, "Do you think the world would be better off with AI or without it?"
Yeah,
And your decision can go either way. I would say I think it'd be better without it. But
I know.
that's an example where it worked for you.
Yeah, Elon Musk has a list of his 10 favorite books. Three of them are about the dangers of AI. So I mean, I think that there are good things and there are bad things, but this is an example of why I think that it will give you accurate information. It will say the right words, but you're going to lose the warmth. You're going to lose the humanity that comes from telling a story about the Beatles. So I said, write me a couple of paragraphs on the recording of In My Life. And this is what it gave me. Certainly, In My Life is a timeless classic by John Lennon. It is a poignant reflection on memories, love, and the passage of time. Let's delve into the recording session. The Beatles recorded In My Life during their fourth recording session for the album Rubber Soul. On 18 October 1965, they gathered at Abbey Road Studios, which in itself is incorrect because Abbey Road hadn't come out yet, and they did
Right.
not call it Abbey Road, it was EMI,
Correct.
to bring this masterpiece to life. The songwriting duo, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, collaborated. Hmm, that's just been proven incorrect. Seamlessly, weaving their distinct styles into the fabric of the track. So here is how it's written in the new book that'll be coming out some forever. 18 October 1965, EMI, 3 Abbey Road, Studio 2. The result was exquisite, each one of them doing something extraordinary. Ringo's hesitant, irregular drum beat hinted at the time delay of memory, reality on pause as one reached back into days gone by. John and George on their matching 1961 Fender Stratocaster Sonic Blues, and McCartney on the deep Rickenbacker bass laid the foundation for John's double track vocal and Paul's double tracked harmony. But it was George's poignant 6-note intro that beckoned the listener into the past, back into the world of yesteryear. 3 takes only, and the new song was complete. Well, with the exception of the piano solo, which John said had to matter. And then it goes into the whole bit where
Hmm.
John and George sit at the piano and he hums what he wants George to play, and George plays the notes on the piano with the left hand and with his right hand writes the notation, and then they do it on the organ and it's not what they want and they decide to think about it. But there's a difference in giving you facts and giving you the facts with feeling. And I think
Hmm.
that's where
Yeah.
it's all short.
Well, you hit on the key word, and that was the humanity.
Yeah.
And it's hard to it'll probably get there, but will it be honest? You know,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's difficult to code, but
Yeah.
we'll find out.
Yeah, it is. It can help. And since I found out that it's a time saver in that aspect, if I can't find something, I'll now go about 10 or 15 minutes trying to find it. And if I can't find it, I got to move on, and
Yeah.
I'll get it to help me. But you know, I can see that something will be lost.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's maybe when people stop reading, or I don't think they're going to be writing. Will history be written that way? We'll see. I'm sure it will be. I guess it is being done now, but how reliable will it be?
Right. It is interesting to me that my grandson, who is writing essays and term papers in Dallas in high school, is not allowed to use it. And it's a great resource, but they make you learn to do research the old way, and that's
Yeah,
a good.
I think if I was a college professor, I'd make my students handwrite their essays, to make sure.
Yeah, yeah, and still, you can copy it, but
That's true. That's
you
very
know,
true.
I'm all for the research aspect of it, but I think there's something to be said about telling the story. Only a human being knows how human beings felt as they record that very vulnerable song. I mean, part of that chapter is talking about how no one in that room after it was recorded could say anything about Stu, even though it's obvious that part of that song is about Stu. His
Mm,
name is never mentioned because it breaks John's heart. You're not allowed to talk about him, and they all know it. And he's very present in the room, but you don't talk about it. And that's
mhm.
something a computer wouldn't know.
Very true. And that's one of the things that makes that one of their greatest songs.
Yeah,
I feel that in their top 10 best songs. It's
yeah,
because of the feeling, it's because of the humanity, it's because of the loss.
yeah,
And it'd be very hard for a software to understand that. I
yeah.
guess it could be programmed to, but not in the same way.
Right, right. And you think about this, John has just turned 25, um, just 9 days earlier, and he already feels the nostalgia that someone generally feels much older.
Well,
It is,
that's one of the things that observations people have made about the Beatles lyrics and Beatles music in general is it's as if they're much older men
Yeah.
singing and writing these songs. And that's an example of one. Yesterday would be another one.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's they lived a lot of life in those short years.
Yeah. A deep, deep feeling. Um, and you hear it in George's songs too. It is an insight into the soul. And I think that's what people are identifying with. You hear people say they went to the concerts and he was looking right at me. He was singing that to me. They have a way to connect with the audience that other people don't have. People honestly believe, and we've talked about that guy in Imagine that shows up at John's house and says, how did you know all this stuff about my life? Why were you singing all this stuff about me? And John goes, singing this about you? I was singing about me. He goes, no, no, you were singing about me. That's what they made people feel.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, very good, Jude. So we're expecting your next volume in early 2025.
Yes. March.
And I understand you have a couple things to send me that I can raffle off for my Patreon supporters. What will you be sending me?
Yes, I think you have Shades of Life. You have two of them right there next to you. Shades of Life and Should Have Known Better, the
Hmm.
bottom two books. I will send you autographed and dated copies of both of those books. And my husband did the cover art for those
Hmm.
books. So I will get him to sign
It
it as
easier.
well so that is signed by both of us. And then I'm going to send the audio book of She Loves You, which is volume 3, and it has a 1 hour synopsis of volume 1 and a 1 hour synopsis of volume 2.
Oh,
Hardest thing
cool.
I ever had to write because it
Mm.
took 20 years to do volume 1. I had to do it in a 1 hour synopsis, but it's a touching beginning to that book. And so then whoever gets, I don't know if you're going to do this for one person or many people, but that's the whole collection.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. We'll have to decide that. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that, but yeah, these books are very substantial,
Yes.
and the one thing I can tell you is filled with all the citations as well, so you can check her work. So that's also very important in this day and age.
Yeah. And a lot of the information that's in the footnotes contains extra material because there's no way that I could work all of the facts into the chapter, or it wouldn't feel like you're in a story. It would feel like you're just in another book that said John did this, Paul did this, this was the date. I'm
Mhm.
trying to make it feel as if you're there. So I can't put every single detail. But at the end, for example, at the end of the MBE chapter, I say, did the Beatles smoke pot in the loo of Buckingham Palace? And then I give you every single person who's commented on it, from Tony Barrow to Ray Connolly to Pete Shotton to each one of the Beatles, so that that is thoroughly covered, although it's not in the chapter.
Okay, very good. All right, Jude. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. I'm sure we've got a lot of fans here on this channel, so I'm always glad to have you back. So we'll get you back here when that volume 6 does come out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love being here, and I look forward to seeing you at the Fest for Beatles fans, maybe.
Oh, maybe. I'm always a last minute decision, so I'll have to see what I'm doing in the summertime.
Everybody loves
To,
having you there. And guys, I want to tell y'all that Matt spent some time visiting with Rand and me at our table, and people were coming up and going, oh, "You're Matt Williamson." I mean, don't let him fool you. He seems humble and unassuming. He is a great star. People were so excited to meet you, Matt, and people really love you and they love your show. And thank you for what you do very much.
well, thank you. It's a labor of love too, and you know all about that. And many of us watching, I suppose, and many YouTubers and podcasters out there that have Beatle content. It is very much a labor of love. So
It is.
I understand where that comes from.
It is. Well, thank you once again for having me. I appreciate it so much.
Anytime, Jude.
Okay. Bye, everyone.